We have 3 samples of dry KHP at 120 Celsius. We are going to weigh each sample. As you can see, these weighing points have labels of 3 different masses. We prepared 3 volumetric flasks. We will add 0.1 normal of sodium hydroxide into the burette. Let me show you how to do it. We will pour it slowly to prevent from spilling. Now you can see that it's over 0 milliliter line, and we will flush out all the air bubbles out. Now you can see that it's exactly at 0 milliliters. First, we're going to start with a mass of 0.8105 grams of KHP. We're going to place a label onto the volumetric flask and pour the KHP into the labeled flask. We're going to use DI water to wash out the KHP from the weight boat and into the flask. Then we're going to add 50 milliliter of water and mix the solution so that the crystals will all dissolve. After mixing it well, we are going to add 3 drops of phenolphthalein. We are going to start the titration by placing the flask under the burette and release the NaOH into the solution. Now we are close to the end point, and we're going to release the NaOH slowly. We are going to turn the knob 1 drop at a time. We have reached the end point, and you can observe the color of the solution and the reading. We will do the same for the second and third sample. This is the reading of the second sample. This is the reading for the third sample. In part 2, we're going to find the molarity of HCl by using the standardized NaOH that we made from part 1. Like previously, I'm filling the burette with standardized NaOH that we just made, and adjusting the volume by turning the knob. Now you can see that it's exactly at 0 milliliters. We're going to find the exact molarity of the HCl. I will be pipetting 5 milliliters of 0.1 normal HCl into the flask. Now you can see that there's 5 milliliters of HCl in the flask. And now we'll be adding 3 drops of phenolphthalein. We are going to mix the solution well and add 50 milliliters of DI water and mix the solution again. We are going to start the titration. We're going to release drop by drop. This is the results for trial 1. This is the results for trial 2. This is the results for trial 3. For part 3, we will titrate the acidity in 2 food samples. For the first sample, we will be using Sprite. We will heat up the first half of the Sprite and leave the other half at room temperature. For the second sample, we will be using apple juice at room temperature. We are going to pipette 20 milliliters of room temperature Sprite into 3 flasks and then titrate using the standardized sodium hydroxide. We will add 3 drops of phenolphthalein and we're going to start the titration. This is the results of trial 1 of the room temperature Sprite. This is the result of trial 2 of the room temperature Sprite. This is the result of trial 3 of the room temperature Sprite. After we determine the acidity in the room temperature Sprite, we will then test the acidity for the heated Sprite sample. Like previously with the room temperature Sprite, we pipetted 20 ml of heated Sprite into 3 flasks and added 3 drops of phenolphthalein. This is the result of trial 1 of the heated Sprite. This is the result of trial 2 of the heated Sprite. This is the results of trial 3 of the heated Sprite. Now, we test the acidity in the apple juice. We prepared 20 milliliters of room temperature apple juice and 50 milliliters of DI water in each flask. This is sample A, and we're going to set this aside to compare the color with the other 2 samples. For sample B, we added 3 drops of phenolphthalein and we will record the endpoint. For sample C, we prepared in a beaker and added a stir bar to examine the pH. Now, let's start titrating for sample B. This is the results for sample B. We are going to test the pH at every addition of 1 milliliter sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 1 milliliter of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 2 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 3 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 4 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 5 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 6 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 7 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 8 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 9 milliliters of sodium hydroxide. This is the pH after adding 10 milliliters of sodium hydroxide.